Bones, muscles, brain, sense organs, respiratory system. What are they all for if not for the master tube, the digestive system? This is a system responsible for processing the food needed by the rest of the organ systems. The major divisions of the digestive system have roles to play in either the mechanical or the chemical breakdown of food. Developmentally, your digestive system starts out with three main regions: the foregut, midgut, and hindgut. Most of the structures in the oral cavity may have different tissue layer origins. For the rest, particularly the alimentary canal, the inner lining is mostly endodermal in origin, and then the muscular portion, the outer portion responsible for the peristaltic motion, that's mesodermal in origin. Other structures, for example, the liver, the pancreas, and even the lungs, many of them are actually just outpocketings of this main tube. The basics on the digestive system, the process of digestion, will as usual be given to you by a crash course, so watch it.
What we're going to do today is imagine that we are going to be a little piece of food and we will travel through the entire digestive system all the way from the mouth to the other end, the anus.
Starting with food acquisition. Kasi bago mo naman i-process yung pagkain, di ba kailangan muna makuha mo yung pagkain. And how do most vertebrates get their food? They use the mouth. But what about me? I have hands. But imagine if you were a fish and you didn't have hands. The only way for you to really get your food is to use your mouth. The mouth is perhaps one of the most diverse structures of the totality of the digestive system. So there are a lot of structures there that may or may not be present depending on the vertebrate group you're looking at. For example, lips and cheeks are the trademark mammalian structures when it comes to the oral cavity. And they are especially there because mammals, mammary glands, we need milk and we suckle that out of a teat. And to get that suction action, you need lips and cheeks. Now you might think, well, as adults, we don't drink milk anymore. What are lips and cheeks for once we are weaned from drinking milk? They're actually still pretty useful. There are lips that are really, really thick, particularly for grazers that always have to pick leaves out of thorny branches. Cheeks may also have pouches to store and transport food. If you've ever seen a hamster just shoving its face full of food, it's putting it in cheek pouches. Some monkeys also even have cheek pouches exactly for that purpose. One other thing that really separates mammals from other tetrapods is the fact that we chew our food. And cheeks are important because cheeks help keep the food inside the mouth. Another important structure you will see in the oral cavity would be the teeth. And mammals are the only vertebrates that actually use their teeth for mastication or chewing food. Other vertebrates just use it as skewers to secure food or to acquire food. They do not use it to mechanically digest food. For vertebrates that only need their teeth to keep it in the mouth, make sure it doesn't slip away or escape, they kind of look the same all throughout. And this is what we call homodont dentition. And then depending on the animal, they can either take bite-sized chunks or they could just swallow the whole thing up. But if you're the type who needs to gnaw or slice or cut or grind your food into bits and pieces, then that is where heterodont dentition comes into play. And that's what you see in mammals. For the details on the morphology and different types of mammalian teeth in particular, I suggest you watch these two videos that I made a really long time ago. Nonetheless, the terms there haven't really changed much. Among the groups of vertebrates with homodont dentition, which would be amphibians, reptiles, and fishes, one of the more memorable types would be snakes, because the way that their teeth work also works in conjunction with the fact that they have highly kinetic skulls. The jaws can move independently so that the rows of teeth along each quadrant of the jaw can sort of pull the prey inside its mouth. But where did teeth come from? The prevailing theory is the outside-in theory, wherein teeth sort of evolved from dermal armor that kind of sank down and then eventually went into the mouth. If you don't want teeth, lips, or cheeks, then you can use a beak. And this is what birds, turtles, and some fishes use. Avian beaks come in a variety of forms and can actually tell you so much about the bird's main diet. They may have notches or some serrations to still keep food from slipping off. Turtles and fishes that have beaks use them to bite off of hard surfaces like corals or sponges. What about the tongue? Well, for those that have one, the tongue actually does help acquire food and or keep it in the mouth and eventually push it down the pharynx. Fishes have a primary tongue. Nothing special about it, it's just an elevation of the floor of the mouth, and the shape just follows the shape of the hyoid bones that actually give it its structure. They can't move it the way that we can because primary tongues don't have intrinsic muscles. But for what it's worth, a primary tongue can still help keep food inside the mouth. Many amphibians have a primary tongue and a protrusible and usually sticky extension. For anurans, this tongue is quite unique because of the way it's attached to the floor of the mouth. When the tongue is flicked outside, it's actually the more posterior region of the tongue that extends to the outside. Reptilian and mammalian tongues have 3 distinct regions, each with 3 different embryonic origins. It's not protrusible in turtles and crocodiles. In birds, it only moves via the muscles that control or hold on to the hyoid bone. Many mammals have intrinsic muscles in their tongues. Our tongues are very, very flexible, and this is important because we need to move the food around our mouth as we chew it. Aside from acquiring and processing food, the tongue also has different functions. Because it has taste buds in it, it's basically a sense organ. Also, it functions in stereognosis, which is being able to gauge the shape, the weight, and the texture of a particular item in your mouth. It functions in thermoregulation, especially for animals that do not have sweat glands. It can be used for grooming. And in the case of humans, we use our tongues for speech. What about the roof of the mouth? That's where we find the palate. Fishes and amphibians have a primary palate. External nares, and then when you open the mouth, you almost immediately see the internal nares, and then that's it. Reptiles and birds have an incomplete secondary palate. When you open the mouth of a reptile or a bird, what you're going to see at the roof of the mouth is sort of like a slit. Crocodiles and mammals have a complete secondary palate. Entire roof of the mouth, what you see, the hard palate and the soft palate, that's already the secondary palate. What this effectively does is it separates the nasal cavity from the oral cavity, especially important so that you can chew your food and breathe at the same time. In the oral cavity, we may find some accessory structures such as the oral glands. There are salivary glands that help moisten food, or in the case of mammals, secrete chemicals that start the digesting process. Some mouth-brooding fishes also produce mucus to help nourish the babies while they are in the mouth. After securing and partially processing the food, it is time to shimmy it down to the pharynx. The pharynx is especially distinct from the oral cavity if there is a palatoglossal arch that borders the oral cavity from the pharyngeal cavity. But if there is none, you can call the whole thing an oropharyngeal cavity. A typical tetrapod pharynx will have the glottis, eustachian tubes, and an opening to the esophagus. Mammals have a nasal and an oral pharynx as a consequence of the secondary palate. Another neat structure unique to mammals is the epiglottis that prevents food from entering the trachea. After passing through the pharynx, now the food can proceed to the alimentary tract, starting with the esophagus. It is very stretchable, as some vertebrates just swallow their food whole. Vertebrates without necks obviously will have a very short esophagus. In ruminants, the esophagus is lined with striated muscle instead of smooth muscle, because they have to bring the food back up so they can chew it again and then bring it down and then bring it back up. The esophagus is lined with stratified squamous epithelium. It is sometimes keratinized in terrestrial turtles, birds, and some mammals to help withstand abrasion. In marine turtles, the esophagus is lined with horny papillae that are projected backwards to prevent regurgitation of slippery food, like seaweeds and jellies. In birds that primarily eat grains and seeds, they have an enlarged portion of the esophagus called the crop, which serves as a temporary holding area for these grains. In some species of birds, this crop can also produce crop milk, which is regurgitated to the baby. Once the food is pushed down the esophagus, it reaches the stomach, the site of chemical warfare with the food. It can come in one or many chambers, and it starts out as a straight tube, but it may twist and curve to save space. Agnathans do not have a distinct stomach, so it's like, okay, it's a fucking tube. That's it. Fishes and amphibians, they have a fairly simple stomach. Crocodiles and birds have a glandular section of the stomach called the proventriculus. That's where chemical digestion occurs. And then a gizzard that grinds the food and mixes it with the secretions from the proventriculus.
Because remember, birds don't have teeth.
You may sometimes even find little stones inside the gizzard, which we call gastroliths. This is why we see birds swallowing little pebbles at random.
So kaya pala ibong Adarna kasi kumakain ng bato. Joke lang!
For mammals, the ruminant stomach is probably the most noteworthy because it has 4 chambers. The rumen and reticulum serve as fermentation chambers because most mammals don't really have the enzymes to digest cellulose from tough fibrous plants. They need the help of bacteria, and the bacteria are in those chambers. After that, it's pushed to the next chamber, the omasum, which is a storage chamber, and then finally the abomasum, which is the actual chemical digestion chamber. As of this point, the food is mixed with the stomach secretions. It turns into this mush called chyme. Now you push it to the next section, the intestines. The intestinal inner lining has villi, and these villi have their own villi, which we call microvilli. For bony fishes, it's fairly simple, but they do have a lot of extensions or outgrowths called pyloric ceca. In cartilaginous fish, it may look short on the outside, but if you actually take a section, you will see inside a spiral valve that coils along the inside. For tetrapods, they have the small intestines and the large intestines. The small intestines are mainly divided into 3 regions, the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. The duodenum would be the section closest to the stomach. However, for the jejunum and the ileum, morphologically, it's very difficult to tell where these 2 sections start and where they end. You're only really able to tell based on the shape of the villi and or the size of the nodules that are associated with them. If you notice that the lymph nodules are aggregating into larger clumps called Peyer's patches, then you're pretty sure you're in the ileum section. You know that the ileum ends when we get to the large intestine. And the large intestine is the section that resorbs water and stores undigested material until it's safe enough to poop it out.
Why does the large intestine need to resorb water? Because you put in a lot of liquids in the form of saliva, the enzymes, the mucus, all to help process it chemically and mechanically. You need to get all that water back, especially if you're a tetrapod living on land where water is very limited.
The large intestine can be divided into the colon and the rectum. The only really notable structure in the colon would be the cecum, whose size varies depending on the diet of the organism. Typically, it's longer and larger in herbivorous species. It's a place for fermentation of these plants with a lot of fiber. To help with chemical digestion, you have a few accessory organs: liver, gallbladder, and your exocrine pancreas. They originate as diverticula from the main gut. The liver produces bile, important in emulsifying fats. Also, it functions in recycling RBCs. The gallbladder stores and secretes bile. It does not produce it. Lampreys, many birds, perissodactyls, whales, rats, basically animals that have a low-fat diet, do not have a gallbladder. The exocrine pancreas secretes digestive enzymes. These enzymes are produced by the acinar cells, and they make their way to the duodenum via the pancreatic ducts.
Wait lang! Hindi ba nabanggit na natin na ang pancreas ay isang endocrine organ?
The secretions of the endocrine pancreas would be the hormones insulin and glucagon, and these are produced by different cells, the islets of Langerhans. In addition, they exit via the bloodstream and not through ducts. The exocrine and the endocrine components of the pancreas may not necessarily be part of the same organ. As in lampreys, dispersed lang, may exocrine stuff and endocrine stuff, but you can't really call it a pancreas because they're not together in one organ. And when it's time to evacuate, cloaca ang labasan. Cloaca is actually Latin for sewer. In placental mammals, the cloaca eventually separates into 3 passageways, one of which becomes the anus.
And that's it! Naipain na po tayo ng vertebrate digestive system.
Taking a step back and looking at the entire digestive system as a whole, what are the main takeaways? Kahit makalimutan nyo na yung detalye, sana man lang maalala nyo itong mga to. The diversity of the digestive system stems from the type and abundance of the food and the animal's shape. Is the food easily digested, or does it require substantial breakdown? Is the food abundant, or is it easily accessible, or is it rare, difficult to find, hard to get? Also, is the animal long or is it compact? Yun yung mga considerations when we look at the design of the digestive system. It's all about surface area, mechanical digestion. What is the whole point of chewing food? It's so that you can break it up into smaller pieces so that it can be exposed to the saliva and to the enzymes. Chemical digestion. What are the enzymes for? At a molecular level, we'll break those chunks into even smaller bits and pieces. Starches into sugars, fats into fatty acids, proteins into amino acids. The structure of the digestive system itself. Why can't it just be one straight tube? Why does it have to be so convoluted, so long? The ceca, the rumen, the reticulum, and all of these chambers. Coiling, the spiral valve, the villi, and the microvilli. All of these are to increase the surface area so that you can extract as much nutrients from the food as you possibly can. Last but not the least, thank God for Uranus. Because with the anus, we can, as disgusting as this may sound, eat and shit at the same time, which means faster nutrient processing. And in the context of evolution, this is what paved the way for increasing complexity. Developmentally, the blastopore, it came first, which in our case, that's the future anus. Before we became who we are, we were all once assholes. If you're not yet stuffed from all that information, then you can go ahead and watch these videos, and I will see you in the next one.